But I'm just telling you, like, nothing like this has ever happened before in history, specifically on this piece of land. And the prophet said all about it, but you can decide, what you think as well.
What is home? Yes, we have our homeland Israel, and yes, we have homes throughout the diaspora. But our current reality is complex. Israel's at war, and anti-Semitism is rising around the world. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for this question of home? Join me, Izzy, as I speak with Israeli and diaspora Jewry to better understand this new complex reality and unpack where we put ourselves in this physical and spiritual war. This is the My Israel Narrative podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of My Israel Narrative. Today we are here with Doug Hershey. Doug is someone who I've kind of came across in a kind of a random way. I think it was I saw you post something on Facebook, maybe in COVID times, even before that, about an incredible project put together on Israel and just the history of Israel and the prophecies of Israel and the Jewish people being in Israel. And I know beyond that, you do a lot of writing, a lot of speaking, and you're a very knowledgeable historian and storyteller, not just about Israel, but about the Middle East, and really just this, as you quote it, awakening of biblical prophecy. So your book, you have Israel Rising, Jerusalem Rising. I'm excited to dive into both of those, but just really tracking thousands of years of history in the region. And on top of that, you also have your own company, Ezra Adventures, boutique travel and education company, taking people to Israel and showing them the uniqueness of it in your own probably beautiful way, with all of your knowledge and understanding of the land and the history. So excited to dive into the conversation from many angles. I just think you're taking the time for doing this bright and early. And I'd just like to start off asking just where you are, maybe quick, anything I might have missed in my intro, and something interesting we should know, maybe that you're even working on right now, if it's not top secret.
Not top secret. No, I think you did great. It's always been sort of a fascination of mine of history and the things that are written in the prophets and how those are colliding. And my travel company, Ezra Adventures, was started with the intention of bringing help. Ezra, or Ezra in Hebrew, means help, and looking to sort of take small group travel and volunteerism and kind of putting them together. And so we were initially doing small groups where we were spending time with Holocaust survivors, working with soup kitchens, helping an organization that helps New Olim get settled in the land. And so just really kind of being a part of some of the needs that are happening as more and more people are coming home. And it was out of that these photo books, Israel Rising and Jerusalem Rising, really came out of that. So initially, the Israel Rising, the photo book that you have, my intention was that, hey, maybe this would be a good advertisement for the travel company. I get some more business that way. And then since then, it really went a completely different way, and the travel company, in a way, is sort of taken a back seat to the photo books and to the speaking, and to you're really beginning to educate. Both in synagogues and churches and community centers and universities and some different places where I've been asked to speak about how things are really colliding in our day, and really for the first time ever having an opportunity to put some photographic evidence with the details that the prophet spoke about 2,700 years ago. So we're really, to me, we're really in a profound time. To kind of put all those pieces together. And of course, thanks for picking up a copy. That's very kind of you.
No need to thank. It's unfortunately it's sitting on my bookshelf in Israel, so I lugged it there. Now I need to get it back. I wanted to flip through it before we spoke, and then I remembered I schlepped it over there a couple of years ago. But I guess also I'd be interested to know if you're open to share what your background was growing up and what your exposure was to Israel, and maybe, both from the historical and biblical perspective, kind of where that.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a Christian home, and it wasn't until about growing up in a Christian home, I always sort of had this love for Israel and the Torah and the prophets, and just was always sort of pulled and drawn into that. And I always said to myself, growing up, and said, if I find out like our family heritage is actually Jewish, like that would make a lot of sense to me. And someone had given me, very unexpectedly, I wasn't even looking for it. Someone had given my last name is Hershey, like the chocolate, and actually given me. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, ironically, so like I'm in that sort of in that world. But somebody had given me a book from like the early 1900s of the Hershey family genealogy and history, and in the front of the book, it talked about how that the Hershey family, the original Hershey family, moving from I want to say like Austria, Germany area in the early 1700s, moving from a Jewish community to the New World, and names were changed along the way to protect, to hide their identity. And then in talking with my mom, it was kind of funny that she said, "Well, your great grandparents are named Israel and Leah," and I'm like, "Mom, like that just never connected to any. Like, why am I just finding out about this?" So anyhow, as I've been going in and finding a little bit more, that is my heritage. And so um, what's ironic to me in that is that, being that I was growing up in a Christian home and sort of in that world, but also having this love for Israel and now my work, it's put me in a very unique place to really begin bridging the gap, for like Christian Zionists or even just churches in general that are just starting to say, like, we read about Israel in the Bible, and now Israel's back in the land, and what's the connection? And
Hmm.
so I've been able to, again, whether I'm speaking at churches or synagogues, or I had the honor to lecture at Hebrew University at one point,
Wow.
to the administrative staff there, and one of their primary questions at Hebrew University, I was actually quite nervous going into that, because here I am speaking to Israeli PhDs, on Mount Scopus, overlooking the old city, and so one of their primary questions that they were asking is, why is it that Christian Zionists are so fascinated with what's going on here? And so I really began to have an opportunity to kind of bridge even sort of what we're going to talk about today, and that there are specific things that the prophets talked about: Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, a lot of these core biblical prophets. A lot of their words are coming to pass in a very tangible and very literal way. So much so where, like, we can nail it down even now almost to photography, to show the then and now, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But really, it's what is happening in our day, whether you're Jewish or Christian or even just historically curious. There are things happening in the land right now that have never happened before in human history, and the prophets laid it all out pretty clearly in a way that human history has never seen before. And that, I don't mean that to sound like hyperbole or sort of a emotionalism or whatever, but there are some clear, profound things that the prophets foretold that are coming to pass in our day in a way that have never happened before. And we're at a time where we can even document that process, which is some of what I've done with the photo books Israel Rising and Jerusalem Rising.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking right now is like, okay, let's say I've never been, as a Jew or non-Jew, well versed in biblical texts, and maybe I don't believe in really any of it. Um, like, I guess my question is, do you speak to audiences that don't necessarily have this foundation of belief and religion and the Bible? And if so, what are their reactions from what you share?
Yeah, those are actually my favorite,
Huh.
because when and how I explain that is, let's just put spiritualism, put Bible prophecy, put all of that aside. There is no other people group. We're just talking about history in general. There is no other people group that have been on a particular piece of land and then forcibly removed, to then come back to the same piece of land for a couple hundred years, and then be forcibly removed for a couple thousand years, scattered to the ends of the world, to then 2,000 years later to come back to the exact same piece of real estate, speaking the same language, the same traditions, studying the same, same ancient texts as their ancestors and forefathers that lived there to begin with. And it just, and not only that, but to have the entire process foretold by ancient writings. There's no other people group that have any type of ancient writings that foretell the destruction and the scattering of the people and their land to again come back to the same piece of land as an identifiable and recognizable people, and not just to return, but to return in a way to bless the nations and to bless the rest of the world and be really sort of in the center stage of of the end of the age, or how things are sort of, however we talk about that. There's no other people group that have had it throughout human history has had any of that experience. It just so happens to be the Jewish people, of whom the God of the Bible said he has made an everlasting covenant with between the people and the land. And those prophets are the ones that said, I will bring you back from the four corners of the earth. I will bring you back to the land that I promised. And so, again, just from a historical perspective, not the Romans or the Chinese or the Greeks or the Persians, nobody has any type of ancient writings from ancient anything that even come close. And so at some point, you can either say, well, this is just, a random coincidence that, well, then there's lots of random coincidences that all surround one particular people group. Wouldn't it just be easier just to say, well, maybe there is a God of Genesis 1. Maybe there is a God of the universe who really did make these promises, because at some point there are so many random coincidences that all collide and all surround one particular people group. There must be something unique about that. There must be something divine about that. I mean, even things like the Hebrew language, Hebrew in general. Hebrew is the only dead language in history to be revived as a common unifying tongue for the people who originally spoke it. And it just so happens that the prophets even said that would happen. In Zephaniah 3, talking about how God will restore the language. And so you have all of these incredible historical anomalies that have never happened before that all surround the Jewish people. Wouldn't it just be easier to look to the source of what God has been telling us all along? And so I take sort of that historical approach, is that, okay, you can argue with the Bible and you can argue with the prophets, or maybe this, or maybe it means that. Okay, well, that's fine, argue, but there are historical facts that are undeniable if you're, if you're, allowing yourself to, to go there and just with an open mind and saying, what is going on? And again, we're at a time and a season where those things are unfolding in a way that we can document that. And that's what a lot of my work has been doing. So Israel Rising then sort of came out of that as not intended to be a spiritual book, but just to say, here's some ancient prophecies, here's some ancient writings. This is that said that would happen. Here's a bunch of history, and then here's some then and now photography based around those prophecies, and then you can decide whether you think this is that. But I'm just telling you, like, nothing like this has ever happened before in history, specifically on this piece of land. And the prophets said all about it, but you can decide, what you think is what.
I have to tell you, after seeing your book and what you did and creating this imagery, when I drive around Israel, there were like points where like I just like almost, I mean, I can't really see it because I don't have the images directly in my head, but I'm almost like, oh wow, like that was barren, or like that had nothing there. Like I kind of see myself like going this like flash. It created just like such a strong appreciation of like this land that already felt flourishing and beautiful to me on a level that I don't think I experienced before. So what you did just for that alone was like, for me, just such a amazing shift in how I saw Israel, physically and spiritually. I'm curious if you've had any interactions, like what's like one reaction or interaction you've had that stands out the most when you kind of bring this whole premise and your book and sharing about kind of what you've uncovered. I don't know if there's any reactions that stand out, people you've met. Just interesting.
We often view history through sort of our current lens. So, for people that are younger than 70 years old, Israel's always been there. It's always been a nation in the Middle East. There's always been whatever. But you know, historically, you know, 80 years, 75 years. I mean, it's, going 120 years of, of Jewish immigration, returning, of Aliyah returning to the land. It's relatively new in human history. Like,
Hmm.
and so we forget just how barren the land was. We forget that the Hula Valley, north of the Sea of Galilee, north of the Kinneret, there is, used to be a malaria infested swamp. Same with Hadera, outside of
I didn't know
outside
that.
of. Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, and some of the photos are in. I mean, this is going back to like the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. It's a swamp. It's barren and desolate and empty, and now it's one of the most fruitful lands in the north. And it's the same with some of the Jezreel Valley, Hadera. If you're driving up, between Tel Aviv and up to Caesarea on the
Hmm.
coast, you're passing Hadera. That also used to be a swamp. And so much so where that region in Hadera back in the, in a late early 1800s, the Ottomans referred to it as the cursed land because it
Whoa.
was malaria infested swamp. Nothing would grow. No one lived there. And, in the early, gosh, I want to say the early 1880s, I think it was, some of these Jewish immigrants who had sold their things and came with some silver and gold, wanted to buy some land, and the Ottomans say, "We got some land to sell you," and they sell them the cursed land. So it's for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years prior. I mean, it's a great deal for the Ottomans. It's useless land. It's worthless. So they sell them the cursed land, and through the process of these Jewish pioneers literally climbing into the swamps and digging out these swamps by hand and with empty soup cans and are importing some eucalyptus trees that are like sponges that soak up a massive amount of water, and they're introducing fish into some of the water to eat the mosquito larvae. And uh, Edward Baron de Rothschild is involved in this whole process, and he finds an African tribe who part of their DNA, they're resistant to malaria, and he pays to move the entire tribe up to Hadera to help drain the swamps. That tribe is actually still living outside of Hadera today, and you can see where some of their communities are. But this is what the land was, and Jewish hands get into it, and now Hadera, there's a thriving, booming city there.
Prime real
It's
estate.
prime real. I mean, 100%. The sort of the one end of the Jezreel Valley, which really has become the breadbasket of Israel. And so, you know, people forget that when the UN approves the partition plan and the portion of land that the Jewish community said yes to, if you look historically on that map of where that was, what they were saying yes to was literally swamps and deserts. Like there was no fertile land. There was no, and they were just saying, yes, we'll take any land. Swamps and deserts, fine, that's fine. And literally here we are, and in less than a generation or two, these swamps and deserts are now some of the most fruitful lands in Israel. And that's not only amazing, but what's even more amazing to me, and this is sort of the premise of Israel Rising, is that in the prophets in Ezekiel chapter 36, Ezekiel, this is 2,600 years ago, Ezekiel is told to prophesy to the land of Israel. And so sometimes we think about prophecy being to people or kings or just people. And Ezekiel is told to prophesy to the mountains, to the hills, to the ravines, and to the valleys. And he's basically saying, when the Jewish people return and when they take ownership of you again, the land will put forth branches and produce fruit. You'll be cultivated and sown. The waste and forgotten cities will be rebuilt, and I will multiply man and beast back on the land again. And so the scriptures literally say that when Jewish sovereignty returns to the land, that the land will physically respond and produce in a way that has never happened before. And we have the story I just told you about Hadera, or up in the Hula Valley in the north. These are two prime examples that for centuries, hundreds and hundreds of years, even non-Jews referring to it as the cursed land, Jews move in, take ownership of the land, and start working the land, and the land becomes probably the most maybe ever, some of the most fruitful land that Israel has ever had, and now producing in a way that had never produced before. And the prophets foretold this 2,600 years ago. And so, with Israel rising, with Jerusalem rising, I've been able to find these old photos prior to 1948 of what the land looked like, and finding those exact locations, finding those exact angles as close as we possibly could find, and to take a now photo to see what it looks like now, but not just to say, hey, these are cool then and now photography, but yes, the land is reviving, but what's even more amazing in a way that history has never seen before, this whole process was foretold by Jewish prophets 2,600 years ago about the return of the people, about the revival of the land, and the revival of the cities becoming again an influential nation in the earth. And that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah. I just like go back to something you mentioned. You said that, we took, and the Jewish people were willing to take anything, the swamps and the desert. But it's very important to find out we were only looking to take, like, it was because we knew, like, that was where we were supposed to be. We weren't willing to take a desert in the middle of Africa,
That's right.
or a swamp in the middle of whatever, the Amazon. Like, it was, but to that point, it wasn't like we took it and saying, because we're coming into a gold mine over here. We knew it was a gold mine for us as a people, but it wasn't to the naked eye, to the logical man, to what have you. It made no sense. And that to me is just like a marrying of so many things at once. So
And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a longing and a pulling back to the land that most Jewish people feel. When I was doing the research for Jerusalem Rising, I had a opportunity to study with a rabbi in San Antonio, Aryeh Scheinberg, and in our conversations, he made a statement that just sort of set me back in my seat, and I actually included it in the book. But he said, that the pull of the land and the pull of Jerusalem is like gravity; you just cannot escape it. And that just that really resonated with me, because that was some of my first experience in the land as well. And I know that in a lot of your previous interviews, you talk about home and what home is and what it feels like, and there is a drawing that Jewish people have in their hearts, that when you put your feet on the land, you can't explain it. You cannot, you don't have a reason for it. You may have never visited before, but there is something that connects to the core core of the Jewish identity when Jewish people put their feet back on the land. And again, there is no other to me, there's no other explanation to that other than to say there is a spiritual connection and there is a belonging, but someone has put that there. God himself has put that there through his everlasting covenants between his people and the land and himself. That's where we belong. That's what feels like home. And whether we explain however we feel home or what that feels like, I have that same experience almost every time I get out of Tel Aviv airport, get out of Ben Gurion and get in a rental car or driving away with a friend. Is just, I'm back in the land, and I just take a deep breath, and it just sort of hits me, and it's like, where have I been? Like, what have I been doing? Like, this is, this feels more like home than the farm I grew up on in Pennsylvania. Like this, just it connects with the heart and the soul. And I know that, speaking of heart and soul, it's one of the things that I think in Jeremiah it talks about, that God says that he will plant his people back on the land with all of his heart and all of his soul. It's the only thing that in the scriptures that he says that he will do with all of his heart and all of his soul, is return his people and plant them back on the land. And that resonates, that connects and resonates. And to me, there's no other way to explain it aside from, God has made covenants, God has made promises, And when we talk about the Jewish people being the chosen people, that divine choice isn't just about people, it's about a people and a land. And when you put those two things together, it's like things are right. Things are functioning the way that God intended. And to your point, it's one of those things is, when you're driving around Israel, I mean, it happens to everybody. I mean, I have friends. I haven't really. I spent the first few weeks of COVID in the north,
Well,
and and so
treat.
I haven't been back. I plan to be back in the next few weeks, but one of my some of the tour guides that I work with has been saying, like, Israel has not been sitting around during COVID. They've been building,
Mm-hmm.
and so so you come back after being away from a few weeks and you go, or a few years, and you go, what has happened? And so to me, a lot of the new pictures in Israel Rising to me now look old,
It's
because of
changed the past 5 years,
much.
dramatically changed. I mean, and it's and in the 3 years so years I was living there, I mean, there was one summer I left for maybe a month and a half. It was close to 2 months, and as I'm coming back, I see the cab I was in. I'm coming back from the airport to Jerusalem, and he takes a different turn, and I like get a little nervous, and then I see we're going through a brand new highway. And like, what country, like all of a sudden you come back after 2 months and now you're just driving through this brand new highway that connects two different parts of the city. So now, because it's just being built before our eyes. I mean, the Western Wall has they've built all this different infrastructure around it. The sky
I
rises in
know I've seen.
Jerusalem. I mean, it takes away a little bit of the quaintness and the authenticity, I think. So that part is like a little saddens me a bit. Like when you drive around Jerusalem now, it's lost
Yeah,
the charm in some places. But at the same token, you're like, okay, we're doing it's the call of the hour. It's what we need to do. More people are coming. More people need a place, and this is how we're going to make it happen. So
I love that.
yeah. When was the first time you went to Israel? Actually, I meant to ask that.
Yeah, my first time was, gosh, probably 20, 25 years ago. And it was actually on a like a unity tour of Christian Zionists and Jews, actually, ironically. And so I actually write about this experience in the intro to Jerusalem Rising. But my first experience was on the Mount of Olives, where it just sort of really grabbed me. And, the iconic site where you're up there and you're kind of
Mm-hmm.
overlooking the old city and the city of David, um, and I just had this moment. It was after, I think it was right after Sukkot, and it's getting cooler, and there's white puffy clouds that are rolling over the city, and I was just kind of taking it all in, and it just sort of struck me, like, these white puffy clouds that are rolling over the city, like, they look a lot like the white puffy clouds that roll over my house back in the States. And it just suddenly, everything became very real and very tangible to me. And so you read about Jerusalem growing up, or you read in the Bible, or you hear news reports or whatever, and it's always sort of this faraway city until it isn't. And suddenly it was as real as anything else I had experienced. And I just really had this moment of of just sort of my feet getting settled, I suppose, in the land, and just really connecting. And so even then, that was long before a travel company or photo books, or living in the land and that kind of thing. But I remember having that feeling of, like, even if it takes 20 or 30 years to come back here, like, I know this is where I belong, this is where I need to be. Or I knew that my heart and my life would be intertwined with the city and the nation. So that was, I want to say, probably the late 90s. I can't remember when that was exactly, but I remember that moment. And I remember um, thinking that, wow, this is not just a real place and a real city, but there are still, sort of back to the prophetic aspect, there are still real prophecies about this city. Like, this is one of the waste and forgotten cities that are being rebuilt. And so, and in the midst of that, it's real people and real problems, but also there's still a very real destiny that's very much alive there.
Right, being fulfilled day by day. You
Indeed.
see it and you feel it. Yeah, yeah. Um, so just bringing it, all this history and prophetic visions and all that, bringing it even more grounded to today, kind of just even past few months and what's happening, both in Israel and around the world. I've seen you just on Instagram and whatnot posting some what I would say is like pretty strong messaging and stronger than what I've even seen, dare I say it, come from the Jewish community, about going home and yeah, making Israel home. And I'm just curious for you if that's totally grounded in a from the perspective of, just biblically and religiously, or if there's other, I don't know, yeah, just kind of like where that comes alive for you, and why you've been so outspoken about it.
Well, talking about top secret uh, projects that I've been working on. Prior to COVID, I had the opportunity to interview 30 pioneers and founders of the state, of people that made Aliyah between 1939 and the
Oh,
1970s, and just to document their Aliyah stories and why they moved, and what they found when they arrived to the land. And I would ask them five different questions about, where did you come from, and what did your family do, and what did you find in the land, and like, what are you most proud of in your life. And we videoed the whole thing. I've got hours and hours of video footage, and so I actually have that ready to be sort of the next stage in the photo books. But when I was doing those interviews, I wept through probably half of them, because here are, people who, whether it was from Europe and losing their families in the Holocaust, or families young at that. I'm thinking of some of the stories. One man in particular from Czechoslovakia at 16 or 17, he and his brother rounded up the family just to have sort of a family meeting and saying, Europe is burning. I mean, think about like a 16, 17-year-old kid saying this to his aunts and uncles and extended family. Europe is burning. We need to get out of here. We need to go home. We need to go back to the land. And, their response was, well, we've ridden through these storms before. Things will be okay. And they sent him ahead of time as sort of a placate him, to go. And he joined one of the young agricultural youth kibbutzes at the time in the 1939, 1940. And his family never made it because they were all deported to Auschwitz. And so here's a and then he went on to be a fisherman in Haifa, and was involved in really feeding this young nation. I mean, he talked about being a fisherman in 1948, and all of his fishing buddies, when the War of Independence came, they stopped fishing to become like the Israeli Navy. And I'm like, just so I understand, the Israeli Navy in 1948 were your fishing boats with maybe a gun on them. He's like, yeah, if we had a gun, I mean, it was like you hear these incredible pioneering stories of now here we are 75 years later. Israel has nuclear submarines, and 75 years ago they were all these old beat up fishing boats. And so you hear these stories of Aliyah and what men and women went through, whether they were forced to go or whether they had a longing. There were communities in Yemen and other places where uh, ambassadors from the Jewish agency just showed up and said, "We're starting a nation. You should come." And the entire community packed up the next day and were getting ready to go.
oh my
And
gosh.
with no persecution, no anything. They just had this longing when someone said, "We're starting a nation in Yemen." Like, they're not reading it in the news or seeing it on the internet, but the entire community makes the decision. Same in India. There are communities. I interviewed some Jews that were their families were from India. Same thing. They never had any persecution, but there's more of this longing to come. And so I wept through that, because I understood, at least on a heart level, of sort of my own experience in the land, of feeling drawn back. I understood why they would make that decision, and making the decision. I mean, it's to go to Israel now is very different than it was 80 years ago. Of course, the land was empty and desolate, and
And they also didn't
it was
know, like you said, like they didn't even know what they were getting themselves into. It was just, it was pure heart.
100%. They heard. they heard stories, and many of them that showed up in 47, 48, they literally got off a boat and were handed a gun and were fighting within 2 or 3 days to protect their families. And so I say all that to say that for why I've been so outspoken is that since 19 or since since October 7th, I mean, the anti-Semitism levels are, of course, off the charts. And if we follow Jewish history for the last 100, 150 years, we see that when that begins to happen, however this works in God's timing, I suppose, is that He's often used that to gather His people back to the land. Um, and even the prophets talk about that. Jeremiah 16 talks about how that God will send, to bring His people back. He'll send fishers and hunters to gather people back to the land, and that's an unfortunate thing. And with fishing, it's like he's throwing out bait for people to come, and then others sometimes will be driven back and hunted. And I hate that that's even the process, but the fact is that that's been Jewish history for the last 150 years, and that's beginning to happen now. And if these same prophets that talked about that the land will be revived and the waste and forgotten cities will be rebuilt, he says that he's going to bring his people back to the land. Like, now is the time that he's regathering it in a way that, again, human history has never seen before. And in Ezekiel, he says that he's going to bring them all back, and he's not going to leave anyone behind. Whatever that means, I don't know. Does that mean that no Jews will be left outside of Israel? I don't have any idea. Um, but I do know that the aliyah that's happening is unprecedented, unheard of, and when Jews are beginning to feel the rising anti-Semitism, the rising discrimination, the rising attacks, it's where else, what else is the land of Israel intended to be for but to be the home? But that was what God had promised all along, was to giving this piece of land forever to to the Jewish people. And again, to kind of put the spiritual aspects aside, if there is a God who is sovereign, um, doesn't he have the right to choose any particular piece of land to give to any particular people group for any length of time that he chooses? Um, and to me, the answer, of course, is yes. And if that is his choosing, and if that's what he is doing through all of human history, then what better place is there for Jews than to return to the land of Judea, of what Jews are carry in their namesake. So to me, it's I don't want to say a foregone conclusion, but it's where the communities are leaning, and it's where they're returning to. And most will say that, and I'm sure that's been some of your experience. I mean, Israel is a hard place to live, but then when you're out of the land and you're living somewhere else, even if life is a little bit easier, you still have this pull to return, and you still have this pull to come back. And just to have a coffee in at a cafe in Jerusalem is different than having a coffee in Philadelphia or New York or Los Angeles. It's
Yeah.
just different, and there's no other explanation other than it's an internal thing. It's something that's within the core DNA and identity of the Jewish heart. And to me, there's no other way to explain it other than God is the one who's put that there, and that goes back to him keeping his covenants.
Yeah. I just keep thinking what you said uh, about the fact that these communities in Yemen and India and whatnot, I mean, just by stark contrast of how we are experiencing the situation today, um, it's almost put us in a more challenging reality, because we see everything. And it's like, when you see everything, you're
That's
like,
right.
so I understand. So I understand the situation. You don't have to come. I get it. Like, I'm here and I'm fine. And look, like, we're standing up for ourselves and we're strong and we're doing this, and that. So it creates this almost contentness in a way, I guess. And not, I don't think to anyone's fault. 'Cause I will say that, like, big picture, and myself included at this point, just part of what I'm doing here stateside is helping to fight the anti-Semitism and a lot of the rhetoric that's been going on, specifically on college campuses. And it's a challenging task because there's one piece of me that looks at history and says, okay. But there's another part of me that says, okay, but we're going to stand up and at the end of the day bring light and show that we're strong people. But somehow, I guess personally, what I'm speaking about and trying to speak about more is finding a way to create the balance of saying, okay, I'm here and I have this task in this moment in this place, but in my heart, I kind of know where I'm going and what's the end goal and
Yeah,
what I see is what I'm fighting for. Like, I'm fighting for the Jewish people and for our right to be and exist in this world, but ultimately fighting for the opportunity to be able to go home and live in, because it's all interconnected, to live at
of
peace
course.
in our home, in a fulfilling way. But yeah, it's kind of, and I will give credit. I mean, I think people are thinking about it more, for sure. Aliyah is increasing, and there's a question. There's a question of when is the time? Is it right in this moment? Is it, you need to put up a little bit more of a fight and show your strength in other ways, and then the time will come. There's a lot of questions around that, and it's what we're trying to unpack here. But
Yeah,
first,
and I'll say too, and I will say too, to that point, and is that exactly like really what you said. I mean, you really need to follow your heart. I mean,
yeah,
should you be here? Should you be there? Who's to say? I mean, I'm not going to stand in judgment of anybody who makes one decision of another. I will say that historically and biblically, we're at a time and a season where the Jewish people have returned to the land. The nation has been restored, and the people or families are regathering to the land in a way that the world has never seen before. At the same time, that there is an increasing level of anti-Semitism that the world has never seen. I mean, the anti-Semitism rates right now are beyond what they were when they were killing 6 million Jews. And so that historically should be some red flags. And so what I've been saying to other friends is, other Jewish friends, is that you at least need to go. You at least need to go visit. You at least need to go have the experience. But we're coming soon to a point. There were lots of Jewish communities in Poland that didn't want to leave Poland because that's where their homes had been for hundreds of years. But Poland isn't the Jewish homeland. Poland isn't the land that's connected in by covenant with the Jewish heart and with the Lord. And we we do our best to walk in that journey. But ultimately, that's if we follow the prophets, if we follow even what Moses had instructed, this is the land we're to belong in, and we're all heading back there at some point. And you
yeah.
know God forbid that we, suffer too much along the way. I mean, nobody likes that sort of thing, but that's, unfortunately, it's the hardship that sometimes drives us back to where we need to be. And so,
Yeah.
it's a hard decision, but these are becoming more and more challenging times. And, if the nation of Israel was created for anything, it was for this.
I will say, though, to point out that the very, very strong distinction between now and other times in our history when we've been forced out of somewhere is that really, I see it from a religious perspective, or if you want to see it just even plain, whatever, however you connect to it, that we've actually been given a place to come towards. So we always had the land, yes, technically speaking. 100 years ago, I could have also chosen to go back to Israel, but I was going back to, like you said in the beginning here, a desolate land. And today I'm
Right.
being given something to actually come home to in like a holistic, full sense. And that is unique. That is, so that in and of itself, to me, is like, you want to have an argument about this. I mean, we're not talking about going to a desolate land. We're talking about going to a thriving nation that will thrive even more if we go and invest our resources and our people and our
100%.
intelligence and whatnot in
100%.
that place. So that I've always tried to steer myself with that motto to not run away, but to come towards, and that's really what's exciting. I mean, yes, we're in a scary, confusing, challenging time, but that's what's exciting about this time. Like, we have a home, we have a place, and
And I mean, and to your point, I mean, if money's not an issue, and if we're not talking about politics or any of those types of things, if Jewish people just listen to their heart, where are they going to end up? Like, it's everyone has that. Again, to the rabbi's point, there's this gravity pull that comes back to the land. That if money's, if you're wealthy beyond your wildest dreams, and there's no political issues, and just if you could live anywhere in the world. Like as you probably well know, I mean, I know lots of Israelis who would say, "I want to move to America, make my millions, and then come back and retire in the land." Like, this is where I want to be, but life is hard here. But if we're just talking about where our heart is, and where that pulling and that longing is, I mean, there's just no question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll end with two good things. One thing I heard that from a rabbi of mine said that nothing with real potential comes without friction, comes without some kind of challenge. So this idea that we would just be able to go there and have no struggle and no friction, I mean, that's a fallacy. Like, it doesn't exist anywhere. I mean, you think life is easy in America and other places. It's also challenging. It comes with different challenges. You've just decided which challenges you want to take and which you don't.
That's exactly right.
Again, different there. And I always make this caveat because I do try and be sensitive to it, because there really are situations that do bar people from making this kind of move for many reasons, be it children, be it serious finances, be it whatever. So we're speaking in broad strokes here, but there is that choice of what do I want to fight for. But I'll just say, and end on this, that when I would tell people that I was living in Israel, specifically when I say I'm living in Jerusalem, every time, wow, you're living the dream. Every single time. So we know where our heart is. We know what we want. It's a question of how do we align it today, right? That's the biggest challenge of human nature: aligning the head and the heart. The head wins out, and when you're watching all the news and all this and that, but we have to try and find a way back to the heart, and that, I think, is what's going to steer us all, not from a place of fear, not from a place of, but right back on track, whatever that's supposed to look like down the line. So.
Yeah, and you make a great point about next year in Jerusalem. I mean, that's the last thing that we talk about at a Seder. It's the very last phrase, to a Jewish reader reading the Tanakh. The very last words at the very end of the Tanakh is the call of King Cyrus to say, those who want to return to the land of Israel or to go up, like, should be able to go up, and that word is Aliyah. So the very last, the very last words of the Tanakh, the very last words of a Passover Seder, it's talking about next year in Jerusalem. It's a pulling. We're living the dream. It is the dream, and it's always been that. And again, that's there, just deep within that identity and that DNA of the Jewish heart. That is just you just cannot remove it. You just cannot escape it.
Yeah. Wow. Hey, thank you. Thank you for taking the time, sharing your insights and your breadth of knowledge, and just wishing best of luck with. I'm excited to see your new project coming out. So please keep us posted on that. And I hope you have a successful, safe journey to Israel soon. Yeah, bringing the light there.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to another episode of My Israel Narrative. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow along and subscribe. Until next time, I'm Yisrael Chai.